Hello and welcome to Business on the Wire. I'm Mitali Mukherjee. In a book documenting and systematically listing events, policies, and incidents, Akar Patel, who's a columnist and chair of Amnesty International India, says the overwhelming outcome of the Modi years has been negative for the country. Whether the prism being applied is on economics, human rights, defense and security, or communal harmony. Akar's book, Price of the Modi Years, documents evidence and incidents that he believes indicate that the clear fall has happened for India and it's happened in the last few years. He joins me now to talk about that. Akar, thank you for joining in and speaking with me about your book that I'm holding over here. I think from when I read it, the big takeaway for me was how you were threading together the core idea that majoritarianism or authoritarianism was really the bedrock for having effected a whole number of changes in a whole number of spheres. Am I correct in that assumption? Was that sort of the running thread for you?
Yes, I'd say that there are two themes that define our country post 2014, and one would certainly be the desire of the state to legislate laws that are aimed at the minorities, especially the Muslims. And these are laws that are not meant to be constructive, and we can talk about the specific laws later. The other thread is that economically, we have shattered the economy, and perhaps this is permanent, that the data that the government has put out and has not been perhaps examined with the seriousness that it should have been, tells us that we are in a place where we haven't ever been in our past, and it's extremely unlikely that the future will be good.
Who would you say is the audience for your book, Akar? Because that struck me while reading it. Who have you written this for? Have you written it for posterity? Have you written it for people within the country to sort of be more aware of what's happened in the last couple of years? Have you written it for people who are looking in from the outside?
No, I would say that the middle part of what you said, which is that it's aimed at Indians. This is our country. This is what has happened to it over the last 7 years. This is what will happen to it over the next 3 years. And I think it's important that those of us who are interested in the polity, whether it is from the perspective of trying to improve it in some sense with the same government as well, or those of us who are purely academically minded and need some data on where it is that India has come since 2014. I think those are the two sets of people that I have written for. I have also written for myself. I think that you tend to learn mostly when you write long form and books, particularly. And I think that for things that I didn't have too much experience in, such as national security and foreign policy, going into the detail of this has given me the sort of information to assess where it is that India has been brought to.
Hmm. Um, let's unpack it bit by bit. The first part or a large part of what you addressed is also the changes in law that you were referring to with a specific focus on religion. That's been, a thrust of where changes have come in from, whether it's interfaith marriages, etc. That has been a sort of a concerted idea, is what your research drew you to?
So, yes, so beef lynching as a category of violence did not exist in India till 2015. And there are two trackers that have been pulled down now, one by the Hindustan Times and the other by India Spend. Both the editors were also sacked, that show that the data tells us that violence on the issue of beef in the public spaces began after 2015. The question is why? And the answer to that is that the Prime Minister pushed for legislation on the possession of beef in that year and in the year before that during his campaign. And BJP states responded with a ban on the on possession of beef. Lynching started almost immediately afterwards. What we've done with these laws is we've reversed the burden of proof. So the laws say that if one is accused of having beef in their fridge or their van, it is for them to prove that that meat is not beef. And what that has resulted in is cases like one in Gujarat in 2019, where a man was accused of serving beef at his daughter's wedding and was not able to prove that this was the case. The state was not able to prove that the meat was beef, and the judge convicted him, saying that it was up to him to show that the meat that had been eaten was not beef. The High Court later reversed that judgment, but the aspects of violence that proceed from the law, and the fact that we are legislating laws that are aimed at a minority and reverse the burden of proof runs through a lot of these laws, including for what is called the Love Jihad laws, which began in 2018 and are today in 5 BJP states. They say that an adult woman's testimony is insufficient evidence for the state to assume that her a conversion was valid. It is for the man and the family that she's marrying into that need to prove to a district magistrate that they did not coerce her. And conversions to what is called the ancestral religion are not counted as being conversions. So if someone were to convert, say, to Hinduism in this country, that would not qualify as being a conversion. So it's a minority-specific legislation, and this is one of many others that we have.
Yeah. In fact, for someone who hasn't read your book, I think the parallel makes it really clear where you talk about on possession of beef, the fact that you could be standing next to a dead corpse with a bloody knife, but you can still be presumed guilty until the evidence points towards you being the one involved in it. But when it comes to the possession of this particular meat, all the onus is on you. So you are presumed guilty right from the start, and that's really the starting point of it. It's also very it's very personal, is it not, Akash? These changes in laws, they're really entering the most personal domain of people's lives, and it would be difficult to pull this thread back.
I don't think it's going to be possible to pull it back, because what these laws do is, A, they empower society to take action. So a lot of states, including Karnataka, have laws which says that if the vigilante acts in good faith, then it is not a crime to have accosted the person that they accuse of carrying beef. So what is happening is society is being encouraged in a part of the world where rule of law has always been quite poor to go and take the law into its own hands. And I think that what we will see, and what we are seeing actually, frankly, is a series of episodes of violence that are aimed at the minorities, especially the Muslims. And every week, I think we find new ways to torture them. This week, it is the fact that in Gujarat, food that has meat and eggs will not be allowed to be on the roads and so on. So each week we have to see what it is that the government and the BJP especially puts out on this front.
A unique tool for having done that also is the fact that that preferred weapon has been these sudden ordinances, right, which just change what has stood as the rule of law or what has stood as constitutional law. For example, most recently, Akash, in the last couple of days, there's an ordinance that is now extending the tenure of the Enforcement Directorate, of the CBI chiefs, something which didn't exist before. That as well seems to stand out as the big change when you look back on the last couple of years, how systematically institutions have been used in order to further a particular goal.
Quite so. I think that for a government that has an absolute majority, there's no real need to go down the ordinance route, especially when you're only days away from a session.
Yeah.
The fact is that a political debate is avoided, and it is done successfully. I think that we can today say that the government was able to pass farm laws without a division vote in the Rajya Sabha and be able to face the fury of the farmers on the street, but not relent on this practice of bending the rules, even breaking them, to make sure that what they want is pushed through. The other aspect is that that part of the polity which is supposed to resist this, either the judiciary or the opposition, doesn't seem to function as efficiently as the constitution requires it to. And when you have a strong person, a charismatic leader with a lot of seats in the Lok Sabha, it seems to me the case that there's very little difference in such a polity from what would not be a democracy. And I think that the outside world is sensing this as well, that if you look at some of the global indices on which India has fallen, the recognition that rule of law and proper democratic process is not followed is seen by the world as actually happening here.
What has your own experience been, Akash, in the last couple of years, particularly with the Enforcement Directorate, with the income tax officials as well?
So, for people who are unused to action from the union government, they might not know that uh, a lot of it can be done at the whim of a minister, and you can deploy the ED, the CBI, the Ministry of Home Affairs, Corporate Affairs, and it's not particularly pleasant. But there is also the sense that the officer that is facing you, for the most part, recognizes that she is doing what is, what she's being forced to do. So there is some element of morality in the people that you engage. Not all the time, I should say, but for the most part, it seems to me that there are people in government who feel that they are being asked to do something that they shouldn't be doing, and therefore they leave some space for you to be able to breathe. That's been my own experience over the last few years.
Um, I take that, but is it not also this sort of brushing into one little silo, people who you see as quote unquote civil society and equal to enemy of the nation? I mean, that's been quite apparent, right, Akar? For example, this last what was it, that debate that happened at NHRC, where the topic of debate was, are human rights a stumbling block in fighting evils like terrorism and Naxalism? Institutions are kind of creating the narrative that is desired.
They are, and I think also one needs to perhaps look at the fact that the intellectual quality of people like Arun Mishra, like Doval, is quite low. So these are not people who you might expect to have a full understanding of what liberal democracy means. I think the perspective that they would have would be fairly middle class, drawing room sort of, the enemy within, Bharat Mata ki Jai sort of thing, and it's difficult to penetrate that sort of thinking. So that's one part of it. But there is no question that what you're saying is right. That institutions from the Supreme Court to all of the central agencies that are supposed to be at arm's length and perhaps even completely independent of the union are not.
Hmm. Let me pivot back to the book and some of what you've documented. For a lot of people, Aka, the other side of the argument has been that in terms of putting down pro-poor policies, the Modi-led government has done very well. And you've outlined about what 14 of his focal areas, where one especially stands out, where he talks about development politics over vote bank politics, and the examples drawn are to the toilets that were created, to the Ujjwala scheme that was given to women. What did you find in your data in terms of how those schemes were A, implemented, and B, where they ran to a couple of months down the line?
So I would say that many of these are good things, and they represent a continuity of a policy.
Previous schemes.
Yes. So the problem is, and this is not necessarily a problem of this government, which is that governance is hard in our part of the world. So the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan's goal was, or should have been, the fact that India get out of the space where our children are stunted and wasted and malnourished. So the whole point of creating latrines and toilets to be used is not an aesthetic thing. It's meant to have a higher aim. Unfortunately, it wasn't projected as being such. I think with the Prime Minister himself taking up a broom and sweeping, I think littering and garbage and rubbish became the focus, to my mind, of what should have been purely a sort of stunting, wasting exercise. And what has happened is that government data shows that the last survey, which is 2019, that wasting and malnourishment and stunting is worse in half the states surveyed over 2014-15, and in some states worse than over 2005. What that tells us is that the outcome of what Swachh Bharat should have been was not the number of toilets built, it's the number of kids who are not wasted and not stunted. There we seem to have failed. Ujjwala, once again, I think that there was a wonderful survey done around 2011, which told the state who are the families that need such support. But the problem is that the price of the second cylinder is not subsidized and it's at full rate. And it's very hard for families used to burning firewood to buy a cylinder at the prices that uh, uh, they are now.
That's right. That's what I hear anecdotally as well, Akash. Not just that it's difficult, but the fact that that cylinder has been pawned in order to get a little bit of money, and then take it from there. Which also seems to be the nature of much of what you've documented in the book. That there's a big bang announcement, and then we are not quite sure where things go.
So Mr. Modi is really decisive. So he likes taking decisions which break from the past, but he's not a man of detail. So he tells us that he's not really interested in reading files, and I think that creates a sort of unusual situation where one is in charge of a fairly large nation. One has a lot of power. One feels decisive and wants to bring about change, but one doesn't want to get into detail. And the other part to it is that one is surrounded by people who are not voted into office themselves. People like Nirmala Sitharaman, Piyush Goyal, Jaishankar, Jaitley before them, and therefore do not have the ability to be able to say no or to say pause. And therefore, what we've run into is a series of government strokes that have produced the conditions that we have today. It may not be well known, but government data says that Indians were spending and eating less in 2018 than they were in 2012. And data from this year says that uh, the levels of private consumption have gone back to 2017, which means actually that they've gone back to 2012.
Yeah.
The middle class has stopped growing in India. The number of cars sold has been stagnant at 27 lakh units for the last decade. The number of residential properties sold per year have been flat for the last decade at 3 lakhs. The data is quite clear that we are in a space where economically we are in the middle of a fairly disastrous phase, and we don't seem to have the ability either to recognize the fact that we are in this space, and certainly we don't have any plan to come out of it.
And the fact that we've pushed many people lower down the pyramid. So now you have the very rich doing very well, in fact, even better post COVID, but you have the poor and the very poor actually decimated after the pandemic and its impact. So I take your point, and I think it's exacerbated. But this is the interesting thing about the approach to economics, Sakar, where there's not been that much policy at all. It's been more about ideas. So it's an idea like demonetization, or it's an idea that GST should be introduced at midnight, whether or not processes are in place. There's one school of thought that believes that majoritarian politics has been put in front in order to shadow all the economic failures. Was that the sort of conclusion you came to as well when you studied all these policies and ideas?
So I think majoritarianism is deliberate. I think that is coded into their gene, and I don't think that they would be different in any case because that's who they are.
Yeah.
The failure of the economy, I don't. Well, you could say it's gratuitous, but it's not deliberate. I don't think he sought to go and make the economy fail. But what has happened is, as you said, that there seems to be a focus on the minor aspects. So Make in India had a fabulous launch, great logo. We spent 11 crore rupees on it. After Make in India, manufacturing's share of GDP has gone from 16% to 13%. In the same period, Vietnam's and Bangladesh's has gone up. So clearly we're not sort of able to execute what it is that we set out to do. Not only that, we tend to reverse things back to a space where they become worse for us. And I think that sort of recognition of the of things is not there, and that's one reason I wrote this book.
There is also sort of the perception now, Akash, that there is a very drastically changed face of business politics relations. Would you agree with that?
I would. I think that we are moving into a sort of oligarchic situation, just like we have in Russia, where a very few people control a very large part of the economy. And I think that some of it is deliberate. So you had Amitabh Kant of the Niti Aayog, who was criticized quite rightly for saying that India has too much a democracy. But in that same speech, what went relatively unnoticed was the fact that he said that the government wanted to create 5 global champions. And so Atmanirbhar Bharat and things like that, which restrict competition from the external world, which make prices for consumers higher in India, but give that business to local magnates. It seems to be a deliberate pushing in. You mentioned the number of billionaires. They went up by 55 last year, while 23 crore people, according to the Azim Premji University survey, fell back into poverty. So, and $28,000 millionaires have left India since 2014. So we are seeing a concentration of wealth in a very small part of the population and a decline. One last data point on this. The share of profit of listed companies in GDP has never been higher. It's 4% of GDP, which means that in a smaller economy, in a shrunken economy, more money is going to the wealthy.
And which also shows that there is much less that is being generated out of MSMEs that are really the backbone of both the economy and for employment specifically. The employment one has befuddled me for many quarters now, Akar. It's clear that there's a problem there. It's clear we've never had such bad figures. And if you move into the northern part of India, Uttar Pradesh, Rajasthan, many of them actually have double-digit unemployment rates. You would expect to see more discomfort around it, but one hasn't. What do you put that down to?
So one reason could be that this has been relatively recent, though it has been pre-pandemic. So India, so post 2014, we have a survey from the government from 2013, which said that the labor force participation rate between 2013 and 2019-20, which is the latest data we have, has fallen by a fifth. So to give your viewers some data points on this, the US has labor force participation, meaning those who are either working or looking for work. That is 60%. Thailand, it's 70%. China, Vietnam, it's 75%. In India, it's 40%. So we've taken a fifth of the labor force out since 2014. And this has happened in the period between 2016 and 2019. So it's relatively recent. 5 crore more people were working in 2013 than are working today, though we added another 12 crore people of working age to the labor force. So it's quite strange that you don't sense a kind of unified distress. There's a nice piece by Mahesh Vyas of CMI some time ago where he said that a lack of job was a personally felt hurt, and it was not easy to be able to share this, and it was not easy for externals to mobilize around it, because you don't want to be seen as a part of a group that is all not doing anything and sitting at home. I don't know, it makes sense to me, but I don't know whether that is the sort of primary reason why we don't see as much externalization of this distress.
Yeah, and I think, as Mahesh has also pointed out, people tend to move away from the workforce. So they're simply not getting counted anymore as someone who's looking for work, because they came in, they didn't find it, and they've gone back. So I think what's happening in rural India is a whole other story. Akar, one side of this narrative has been the fact that there's a lot of pro-poor policies, and the other has been that here's this person and here's this government that is now giving India its its much awaited time on the global stage. Here we are as equals now. Here we are demanding what is rightfully ours. And that whole defense story has also turned quite sharply, has it not? Because, you've documented that in your book, in the Doval Doctrine chapter, how terrorism was seen as the big threat. But really, by the end of, where things stand right now, it's not terrorism, it's threats from our neighbors and infiltration and death of security personnel.
Sure. So we started off the Modi years with the assumption, according to Mr. Modi, that terrorism was not just the biggest threat to India, but to the world. And he said this several times. But what has happened is that we have shifted our forces and sent many more people to the frontier against China. And that has happened by default rather than by design. So we didn't have a national security doctrine that Mr. Modi was able to put together. The assumption was that Pakistan was the main threat and we should be focused there. But what has happened over the last 18 months is that has been upended fairly obviously and fairly violently. I think it has happened that we have been yanked into this rather than gone into it with thought.
You know, you write in one of your chapters, Akar, such societal change is not easy to undo. Once the infection has set in, it festers and damages the nation. Uh, this is something that several economists have pointed to as well, like Dr. Kaushik Basu, for example, that there is this, unquantified damage that is happening to the economic growth and potential of a country because of the kind of social distress that they are living through. Were you able to see that when you were tracking through all the very many threads that you were?
So let's say that if 14% of your population, some of whom, including in Gujarat, in Karnataka, in Kerala, are minority groups who come out of mercantile communities, would they feel encouraged to invest in those spaces where publicly they become uh, centers of hatred and of attack? If you want to run a hotel in Gujarat, would it be easy for you as a Muslim to say with confidence that you will actually be allowed to do that? I would say the answer, I'm not a Muslim, so I can't say that, but it seems to me to be the case that it would be difficult given what is going on, that no Muslim ownership is acceptable to a large part of the population, and they are vocalizing it. And I think that that sort of creates a situation in your polity where there will be large numbers of people who ask themselves whether they should be risking their capital and their time on things that might run into trouble fairly soon. The other part is, I think that the damage that we are doing to society in terms of what we are teaching our children, where we are sort of headed as a nation, it can't really be quantified. These are not things that the NCRB records. Hate crimes as a category is not actually recorded in this country, and I think that we are going through a phase that Pakistan went through in the 80s, where it set itself the goal of going after its own population, large parts of it, and succeeded in reasonable measure. And look at where they are now. I think that we seem to be in a similar space. The only difference is that in our condition, it seems to me that the population is responding to the laws. That there seems to be enthusiasm about the beef laws and the love jihad laws and of taking eggs and meat off the street, which is not a good sign.
Where does it pivot, Akar? Because it always does. You know, if you look at political history or economic history, and it happened, for example, with the UPA. By the time the second round came around, there was rampant corruption, and they were voted out. Where does it pivot? You think? At what point?
There would be two. One would be the one that's linked to politics. That I don't think will come soon, because I think the BJP is really well organized, really well funded. They know their constituency quite well. So I think we will have Mr. Modi for the next decade or so. On the on the other side, modernity usually doesn't tolerate nonsense. So I'm saying that we have a very limited period in which we can defy the world and defy the world's rules. And I think that that period would be about 15 or 20 years to my mind at the most. We will come out of it at some point in the next couple of decades. But I think the damage will be severe. I think that the ability of this nation with its hundreds of millions of people to enter into higher middle income or even take itself out of that space, the time is extremely limited, and I don't think that we will be able to do so. I think we'll remain an extremely poor, very divided society, which will be quite violent.
Yeah, and I'm struck by the point you made earlier, Akar, about how what the response to these rules has. I mean, if you were to just sort of fast forward and run through the headlines of the last 10 days, I was looking at that. So, two journalists arrested in Tripura for reporting on an incident. No, display on main roads of eggs and meat, as you said, in Ahmedabad. The CBI and Enforcement Directorate term extended. Salman Khurshid's house has been burnt based on something that he said in a book. The head of the army now says it's okay for civilians to lynch terrorists. It's non-stop, but it's getting a lot of it's a feedback loop. It's being accepted, digested, and given a thumbs up amongst many.
I would say that's absolutely right. That I don't think we have internal resistance to the poison once it is actually injected. And I think it will spread fully and cause the damage that it is actually intended to do before we begin to come out of it.
So, where are those that are trying to find reason going wrong in their analysis, Akar? Because, I was struck by so many parts of what you wrote, and in the end, you write it produces the obvious question: what exactly is Hindutva good for, and why should India embrace it? And I place it against a recent op-ed where someone pointed out that to his core supporters, Modi is not merely a persona or a politician. He embodies an indestructible idea, a faith that the Indian civilization is now, rising to its rightful place. Um, how does one marry the two?
I think it happens either when the data is clear to the second set of people that it has not risen to any sort of level of magnificence, that we remain a very poor country, that we have fallen, that GDP per capita has fallen behind Bangladesh, that our labor force participation is lower than, now it's lower than Pakistan's, that we have gone back on so many fronts since 2014 according to government data. This is not something that civil society or the enemies of the nation are saying. This is what the government is saying. If there is recognition of that, we might then be able to look at ourselves and ask ourselves what it is that we can do to change, what it is that we can do to correct. If there is no recognition of that and we want to continue down this path because we are enthused by the other aspect of it, which is the violence that is aimed inwards, then I think we will continue down that path. I hope that there are many more of us who see the damage that we are doing to ourselves and are able to stop and look at ourselves and then reverse course in time. My fear is that there might not be that many of us, and that many more of us might actually want what is going on to continue into the future.
One final question then, Akar, whether in that case you believe the resolution will have to be political. For a lot of people, they felt the kind of damage to the GDP, like you pointed out, the damage to individual jobs, that was going to make things crack. Or the kind of attack there was on freedom of speech or freedom of rights, that was going to make it crack. Do you believe, though, that the resolution or any change in the current situation will have to be politically led and politically solved?
Absolutely, that's the way that democracies function. We cannot have groups of people who haven't been voted in determining what it is that the nation should or should not be doing. It will have to be through the vote. It will have to be through a population that believes that we need to change the way that we have done things over the last 7-8 years, and we need to reverse course on many important things that we are not even talking about at this point in time.
I wish you luck, Akar. Thank you for documenting this. I think it's been a very sombering walk through the last couple of years, but it's a necessary one as well. Thank you for joining in today.
Thank you very much.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.